Right. And so now we go to our next speaker, Shaira Panela. Shaira is a proud hatter, cook, and Philippines. She wears many different hats as a science journalist, editor, mentor, science communicator, researcher, strategic communications consultant, and a STEM advocate. Um, Her brand of science journalism is distinct for its rich analysis and attention to detail. This helped her win recognitions both in the Philippines and abroad. She is a Henry Ford Awardee for motoring journalism, a Lasallian Scholardom Awardee, and an Asian Scientist Writing Prize Merit Awardee. She also had a fellowship in science journalism from the World Food Federation of Science Journalists. Shaira contributes stories to Asian Scientist magazine and Rappler, but when she's not writing or teaching science communication, you will find her in the kitchen cooking hearty meals for the people she loves. Shaira's talk will bring us to the world of science communication through journalism. Hi, Shaira. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Can you try sharing your screen?
Let me see. Wait lang ah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay. So before I start, let me just introduce myself better. Right now, I'm working part-time as a communications assistant for Clean Air Asia. And at the same time, I write for Rappler Asian Scientist magazine. And I do other types of strategic communication, mostly in the field of science comms. I've been working in science journalism for the past 7 years and in the media for the past 10 years. So in this presentation is going to be about the notes that I've realized in my 10 years of working in the media. Okay, so first, I have realized that there is an increasing demand for science content online and offline. I remember when I started to be a science journalist in 2012, parang ako pa lang yung at my age na science journalist noon. All the Filipino science journalists are kind of like titos and titas already. And it was fun kasi I was learning a lot from them as well. And not only that, there's a demand for younger science journalists in the Philippines, but also there's a demand for more content. I was working at GMA at that time, and yung experience ko is yung science content sa GMA News Online was the most visited page of the website. And at the same time, started become a freelance science writer, many are approaching me to write about the different types of breakthroughs, discoveries, etc. And I wish I could handle all of them, but I can only do so much. Science communicators, science journalists can work hand in hand. The thing is, there's a distinction usually between science communicators and science journalists. In the Philippines, ito na lang yung ibigay ko na pinaka-simple na distinction nila. When you say you're a science communicator, you write or you communicate for the interest of scientific community. And when you're a science journalist, you write for the interest of the public. But that doesn't mean na science communicators do not write for the interest of the public. Science journalists could be science communicators could be science journalists at the same time. And the thing is, it's basically, there's more studies about science communication worldwide, but they're lacking in more science communication and science journalism studies in the Philippines as well. So hindi pa siya masyadong na-study, and sa experience ko, even yung history niya is medyo mahirap siyang tawag dito, mahirap siyang i-track. Okay. So, because we're a developing country, it goes na yung science na ginagawa sa Philippines is a public good. And yung quote na to, science for the public good can only be realized when science is informed by communication and journalism. In the sense that as a science journalist, I think my biggest role is that I need to inform people about and raise awareness about the scientific things that are happening in the Philippines, precisely because it impacts people. It impacts Filipinos. It's important for Filipinos to know more about what's happening. And more often than not, kasi before this presentation, I was wondering ano yung mga pwede ko isama, no? So, a few tips lang to be a better science writer, science communicator. If ako kasi, I didn't come from the field of science. I graduated with a degree in journalism. So, sometimes it works on my favor, sometimes not. Kasi it's not every time that I understand everything about what the story is about. But scientists, more often than not, like to share their studies and their stories. And it's the science communicator's role, science writer's role, to translate it and provide enough context. Context is very important. That science doesn't happen kasi in a vacuum, especially in the Philippines. We could, like now, yung COVID-19, we know very little about the virus, but we're increasingly understanding what the virus behavior is about, and we're increasingly knowing how to fight this virus, and dumadami yung mga studies about vaccines and therapies, and they're being shared. And it doesn't mean na yung mga scientists, they just work inside their labs and focus on their science, but minsan kailangan lang nila mag-approach sa kanila to ask what their study is about, and they will give their stories. And one of the most important questions that I keep asking whenever I write a story and whenever I teach about science writing is, so what? In the Philippines, sabi ko nga, diba, science doesn't happen in a vacuum. So what if your breakthrough is about, for example, using VCO as a food supplement for COVID-19 patients? So what kung gagamit ng VCO for COVID-19 patients? So what if there's a new ventilator? So what if there's a study on harmful algal blooms or red tide? So what if there's a new study about remote sensing for agriculture? So what if there's Diwata 1 or Diwata 2? Kailangan ini-emphasize natin yung relevance and impact ng mga studies and ng science to the public. Kasi what the people will not be able to relate to the science if they don't understand what's its implication to them. Anong importansya niya para dun sa mga magsasaka, para dun sa mga mangingisda na hindi gaanong naintindihan kung ano yung pinag-aaralan sa loob ng mga laboratorio. And another thing, strike a balance between what the audience needs to know and what they want to know. Like ko sinasabi, there are many different scientific stories in the Philippines. Sometimes these are the things that the audience wants to know. For example, kailan yung next na meteor shower? Ano yung mangyayari? Kailan yung next na pag-launch natin ng panibagong satellite? And what the audience needs to know, anong mga studies na ginagawa natin in terms of COVID-19? Nagsisequence ba tayo ng genomes ng mga patients to be able to understand the disease better? And those are the things that are important. for us to know. And sometimes it's always a challenge for writers to be able to determine which ones to prioritize. How do we prioritize? The news values, the journalistic news values matters a lot, like timeliness. If the issue is timely, for example, right now, the timeliest stories about science is about COVID-19. It's also about prominence. Prominence in the terms of if it's something that is widely known. Pero katulad nga sinabi ni Cami kanina dun sa presentation niya, not everyone knows a scientist, a Filipino scientist. And whenever I teach science writing, I always ask them as well kung may kilala ba silang Filipino scientists. And totoo yun, Fidel Mundo tsaka Agapito Flores yung lumalabas sa sagot. And it's quite sad, pero right now, we're having more visibility ng mga Filipino scientists, online especially. And it's nice to be able to get acquainted with this scientist as well. Okay. Next is never be afraid to ask questions. Since hindi ako scientist by profession, I tend to ask a lot of questions, and there are no stupid questions. Lahat ng questions ay valid, and it's better that you ask questions. And lagi kong ine-emphasize nga kapag nagtuturo ako magsulat is that it's better that you ask questions kasi it has value on the story that you're writing. And never be afraid na magkamali whenever you're asking questions. Kasi nasa process yun ng pagsusulat. And the most important skill of a science writer is critical thinking. It's difficult to teach, especially kung ituturo mo to kapag may edad na. But it doesn't mean it cannot be learned. But it's important to be able to learn it from an early age. I teach science writing to elementary students. And sometimes even yung reading comprehension nila is problematic. But that's for another discussion. But what I think is there are promising writers at an early age, like elementary. And pinaka-valuable sa akin if they can get the angle right, if they're critical thinkers enough to get the angle right. And does it mean so paano matututo pa tayo ng critical thinking? It takes a lot of practice and takes a lot of reading as well. And exercising your judgment in terms of what kind of stories you want to pursue. Okay, so I made my presentation short so I can handle more questions.
All right, thanks very much, Shaira. We can actually have like one or two questions. Okay, so the first question is how do you ensure that data isn't taken out of context or misinterpreted? And can you talk about more how we can like fight misinformation, especially about science data?
Okay, so how do you make sure that the data is not taken out of context? One is, first, you have to make sure that the source of the data is verifiable and reliable. For example, what I always say is that numbers do not lie, but numbers can be used and made to lie. So one, ensure the source is reliable and verifiable. Second one is that you make sure that you also understand the context of the data. sometimes madali kasi tayong ma-enamor in terms of like there's a study saying like 7 out of 10 patients are cured of this disease. Pero it doesn't really mean na cured siya. It just so happens na nag-improve yung condition niya. So, how do you put context on it? You make sure that all the underlying events and context are included in your report. And at the same time, you provide also context in terms of the methodology on which the data was taken. Sometimes kasi, halimbawa, yung data mo is 7 out of 10, pero ang sample size mo pala is very small. So, that's misappreciation of the data in itself. And then, the second question is about how do science communication fight disinformation, right?
Yeah.
It's not just the science communicator's role to fight disinformation. Right now, especially COVID-19, we have a special role in fighting disinformation, pero it's not just us. It's not just the scientists as well. It's everyone who understands role to fight disinformation. It's a very pervasive problem. One thing is that we have to stick to the facts. We have to stick to the science. We cannot be swayed by, for example, an opinion by someone who is not an expert in infectious disease, talking about which drug could be promising. We have to stick to what the evidence is saying. For example, merong four drugs currently on trial, solidarity trials worldwide. And one is showing great promise. Does it mean na yun na yung gagamitin ng lahat? We have to still be cautious about it. Kasi science, ang practice ito is there's a lot of uncertainties as well. And we have to respect those uncertainties kasi it's an ongoing process. Studying is an ongoing process. And what the current evidence is saying, maybe I can cite an example, yung conspiracy theory about where did the virus come from, if it's lab-made or if it's natural. The evidence is, the consensus is that it is natural. It's not lab-grown virus. It's not a lab-grown virus. The genetics of the virus tells us that it is natural. So, paano natin paniniwalaan yung mga conspiracy theories na ganon? We have to understand din kasi where these ideas are coming from. Politically motivated ba sila? If these kinds of information are coming from a propaganda. And we have to be, kaya nga sabi ko, di ba, kailangan i-exercise yung critical thinking in terms of appreciating scientific content. And that's the only way to fight disinformation and misinformation right now.
Okay, thanks very much, Shaira. There's a lot of questions coming in, but unfortunately we couldn't really accommodate them. But if you're okay with that, you can reply to every person who have questions from the chat box, like what Renee did a while ago, if that's okay with you. Yeah. Again, thanks very much, Shaira. That's a very interesting presentation. I really agree that we have to robustly synthesize evidence before making a consensus or making like an agreement. And there's like a couple of ways on how to synthesize knowledge and evidence. Right, so I think we should go to our next speaker. Can you stop sharing your screen for me?
Yeah, wait.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. Let me just... Okay. Right, so our next speaker is Dr. Michael Rivera. Michael is a Filipino-Chinese paleoanthropologist who was born and raised in Hong Kong. He loves food, travel, crosswords, quizzes, film, and TV, and he's currently a podcast host of the Art and Ant podcast. Michael gained his PhD in biological anthropology from the University of Cambridge in the UK and has worked, presented, and studied in Hong Kong, the UK, Denmark, France, Spain, the US, Estonia, Latvia, and the Netherlands. His main research interest is the story of human evolution and especially the many biological and cultural factors that lead to the human diversity we see around us today. He does this mainly through the scientific study of human remains. He reads bones and teeth to investigate dietary questions, health profiles, and lifestyles throughout our history and around the world. Besides research, Michael is also passionate about working in science communication, improving the diversity we have and who practices science and ensuring our research will have beneficial impacts to greater society. For today's session, Michael will share how he communicates science through podcasts. Hi, Michael. Hello.
Thank you so much for welcoming me.
Yeah. Thanks. Can you share your screen?
Yeah, I will do that right now.
All right, thanks.
Give me 1 second. Okay, I can share this now and it should work. Okay, everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, hi everyone. First, I send all my good wishes to all of you and your loved ones. I know it's a very tough time right now, but I see you, and I want to thank you so much for coming together as a community to escape for a little bit and talk about something that we all have a very common passion in. You can find me on Twitter if you want, and tweet about my talk if you want to. So I am going to go to the next slide. So I am Dr. Michael B.C. Rivera. My father is a Filipino man and my mother is Chinese, and I was born and raised in Hong Kong. This is just a little introduction to my background. I went to the UK. I got my degrees. I graduated from University of Cambridge with my PhD last year. And what I specialize in is in the study of biological anthropology. So the study of humans from a biological evolutionary perspective. So my friends and I look at very interesting questions like why are humans so diverse culturally and biologically? Can we explain that through the study of fossils, of genetics? And how do we compare to like our closest living animal relatives like the monkeys and other apes? A lot of my own research concentrates on the human skeleton, as you can see there. And I think that by looking at people's bones and teeth in archaeology and being able to understand human evolution and lifestyles in the past is so cool. And there came a point in my PhD where I really wanted to share all of this cool science with others. So I also started to tweet a lot and become a lot more active on online media. I'm here today to talk to you about my archaeology and anthropology podcast, of course. But before I tell you about the origin story of that, I have to put a disclaimer. I have to confess that I don't speak any Tagalog yet. I have only started learning very recently. So if you want to tweet any vocabulary words to me, like useful everyday phrases or like food or scientific words from your own disciplines, I would love to learn more Tagalog from all of you. So let me start with a question. Have you ever thought about how humans are able to give birth to babies and how women's bodies, especially their hip bones, are developed for childbirth? How many million years of evolution did that take to develop our hips so that growing girls and women, how is it facilitated that the birth of a species with such, giant brains, babies are born with relatively enormous brains relative to their body size. And so that is just one of the many examples of a question that, me, my best friend, Sarah Louise DeCroza, and many others would challenge public audiences and kids to think about at science festivals in the UK. It always sort of bugged me, though, that we could only ever talk to 40 kids in a class, or we could only give a talk to 100 people in a public lecture. And I wanted the reach to be bigger. So the week that I graduated with my PhD, I also created the Archaeology podcast, where I interviewed my friend, Dr. DeCroza, about her hip evolution research. And then I shared it online as an audio file. And so that's the strength of a podcast. Podcasts are great media because you can sort of listen to it anytime that you are taking a walk, you are cooking, you are sort of getting ready for your day, or you're on your morning commute. And so, you're able to learn something, but then, stop it if you want to. And then when you get back onto the public transport in the afternoon, you can listen to the rest of the episode. So it makes it really convenient, this medium. And I think that we have had so many different experts along the way talking about something different every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And, thus this podcast about human history, biology, and culture was born. And it is run like a very well-oiled machine as well. We are at 119 episodes now. And we have talked about the scientific analysis of ancient bones, of plants, of stone tools, so many different things. But let's talk about some of the early days of the podcast. So, and this is some of the variety of stuff that we've looked at. It is just, so many different experts around the world, many of them Filipino, some of them like from Brazil and Mexico, the United States, Australia, from South Africa, and they talk about all sorts of things. So you can sort of get a glimpse of the diversity that we have here. When it comes to the early days, I was so worried that like nobody would listen to this. And even from the start, I realized that people were listening, and I was quite relieved. People within my field were telling me how it was a great way to present their work because they had never been sort of long form interviewed like that before, and it made them feel special. And so I think depending on the university that we are at, sometimes the chances to do outreach are quite limited, right? And they're not really supported. And so maybe podcasting could be an option for many of you who are thinking about what you could do. Another remarkable thing that I thought that I saw was that a lot of people within our field were listening to each other's episodes to learn about the current work. So it was a great way to keep up with each other's research. And when I had undergraduate and master's students on, they and their supervisors told me that it was a great way to highlight the work of also the young scientists, the future generation, sort of dispelling the myth that only people with PhDs contribute new or important research. So the podcast has really highlighted the work of a lot of junior scientists, and I'm really proud of that, basically. When it comes to, later on, it was also really encouraging to see that some of my episodes were then starting to be included on school curricula and university syllabi. And I even received some messages from like a lot of the public. So there was one Catholic priest, and he told me that, he studied archaeology in college many years ago. And in the podcast had reignited that interest in human evolution 30 years later, which is awesome. And I also began thinking lately about expanding the themes that we cover as well to include important social and scientific issues, depending on who the expert is. So one example is, of course, tackling matters of identity, of race. We talk about that quite a lot these days, gender roles. We talk about what it means to be an indigenous scholar, what is scientific racism, what we can learn from ancient pandemics, which is very relevant now, and also the history of our sciences that don't always have very pleasant stories to tell, but they're nonetheless important to learn about. So, tips on getting started if anybody wants to know how to produce one. You have to first do like some market research, and you have to find out what topics people are interested in and are talking about, like on social media or even like over your family dinner table. And I remember also listening to what narrative structure works for people. You have to get equipment. You have to think about like your logo. You have to get an illustrator for that, find free music, and then you have to invite the guests and, of course, find some way of recording, which I use Zoom, for instance. And then a lot of the technical steps follow. You have to edit your show, make it sound good. You have to upload it onto a server. And I use this server called Libsyn, and then that automatically sort of fires it to iTunes, Google Hangouts, Spotify, a lot of the popular, platforms for podcasts. And then you have to create a website. And it does take a lot of work to set this up right at the beginning. But of course, if you put in the work, then you'll get your podcast out there, and you have to let people know the SciComm that you are doing. I think a lot about what this means for academia, first of all. So like I'm an academic firstly, and the research is sort of spreading faster because people are listening to each other's episodes. And that's really cool to see collaborations being built from that. I also talk a lot with other members of our associations about how we can change the way we can talk about SciComm. I think that sometimes online engagement is not really valued in job promotion or job hiring, or whether someone gets a PhD offer. But I think that's changing. And I actually have heard that some of my guests who were on the show have been given a PhD offer because the panel was so impressed with their interview about their master's work. So I think the conversation is changing, but also I think we all have a role to play in changing the conversation ourselves to make sure that SciComm is valued in academia. So I just want to talk about like the bigger picture and what it means. And so some benefit to me, I always thought to myself that if I could get one expert's words into a listener's ears, I would have done my job. And so it has been really encouraging to know that all the episodes altogether have been listened to over 50,000 times. And I think I've done my job now. And it's so cool to know that people are aware of the work that we're doing. And also the conversational style and the interview style, I think allows for sort of that understanding to be built and that trust to be built in scientists to know and to learn about how the work of that we do is relevant to other sectors of society. They are aware that also our field is very diverse, and there are some scientists who do bad science. And so hopefully through this podcasting medium, we're able to highlight the most positive attributes of our field. I also want to talk about, like, for me, I was telling my boyfriend the other day that it has been really educational, even for myself, to talk to experts, including ones from the Philippines. And I'm going to, copy paste a couple of links into the chat so that you guys can have links to some of the people that I've featured on here. There's something so humanizing about it. And doing the podcast has brought, these episodes have brought a light to many people's days, especially now. And, 3 episodes a week, it's entertainment, it's education, making people feel less alone. And my hope is that, to use the platform for more engagement in the future, to do live events, to do, maybe video one day. And hopefully listeners and organizations in my field will continue to support the podcast. But yeah, if anybody wants to talk about how to do one and you guys are interested as well, then feel free to definitely get in touch, and I'll be happy to sort of help you out in any way that I can. Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thanks very much, Michael. That's a very fantastic presentation. I myself have been listening to your podcast since we met on Twitter 2 months ago. I think we can accommodate 1 or 2 questions, specifically on first, how do you grow your listenership in podcasts? And the second one is getting a master's degree or a postgraduate degree very, very, very important for people who wants to go to a SciComm career?
Right. I think that, so to answer the first question, how you grow your listenership, I think it's actually very relevant advice no matter what kind of SciComm you do, whether you're in journalism or whether you're doing YouTube videos, whether you're doing, you're just tweeting threads about what you do. And the thing that I always try to communicate to students when I've taught them SciComm is to know that people aren't, as much as you want them to, they're not as invested in the stuff that you're doing. They won't, it's far harder to convince them that, fruit flies are important, or that like understanding how a strawberry grows is important. More people, most of the time, are actually very invested in you and the message that you're sort of building. And that's why I think that's so important for all of us to be very authentic to the things that we find passionate enough. And that passion is actually quite contagious. And it'll actually make a lot of people sort of excited with you if you share that very openly and honestly. Because I think people are looking for that narrative, and the people are looking for that connection. So how do I grow the listenership? All throughout the last year, I basically, make sure that I'm asking people, oh, I heard that you listened to this episode, or I could see that on Twitter. What did you think about the episode? And you just sort of like keep them engaged, and you ask them, we had an episode on Filipino migration to the United States. Is that part of your family? Have they migrated to other places? If they haven't, why have they stayed in the Philippines? There's that connection there, and I always try to connect to the listener through like, private and really open conversations. It's all about that connection. I don't think that you need a postgraduate degree in science or in SciComm to do SciComm. But depending on the programs, they can definitely give you those skills. If you're doing an academic postgraduate program, it is so unlikely that, quite frankly, it is so unlikely that they will teach you a lot about communicating science. And then you'll have to sort of supplement it with workshops and courses that you take on the side. So, take a look at your universities and what training they give you, if this is something that you are invested in. But there are definitely ways to learn remotely, to learn for free, to learn on the internet instead. There are so many ways to like sort of build your brand. If you pay for a course to do that, I just think it's sort of they offer different benefits. Basically, like you have to weigh the costs of taking that time and taking that money to do that. But just explore your options and try and see what would work for you in your careers.
Right. Thanks very much, Michael. And for everyone, if we weren't able to answer your question, I think Michael would be very happy to answer them. You can direct it to him in Twitter. You can follow him in Twitter as well. He shares a lot of information in his Twitter handle. Right. I think we can go now to our next speaker. Michael, can you? Okay. Thanks very much.